Yeah, we okay? Yes. First question, of course, had you heard about Patrick O'Connell?
The answer is no, and it's much to my dismay. And then I started to read up the history of the man himself, what he has done, what he's done in the game, what he did at Barcelona as well too. It's absolutely unbelievable.
Had you heard about Patrick O'Connell?
No. And the more I hear the story, the more ashamed I am that I didn't know.
Patrick O'Connell?
Never heard about him at all.
Very few people would know, to be brutally honest, that the man ever existed. I think that's tragic. I think that's tragic. Sad and tragic.
He disappears off the map, you know. How can that possibly happen to someone like that? It's like Alex Ferguson disappearing.
For all that greatness, he ends up living alone in London, destitute on the streets, dies in a pauper's grave, and is lying there for years and years and years. It is just extraordinary.
I think it's the most compelling story I've heard in football for a long, long time. You've got to hear this, you've got to listen to this. This is incredible stuff.
From today's perspective, it's really very difficult to imagine that a man who captained Manchester United and managed FC Barcelona and several other European top clubs, and now we can't even find any signs of where he's buried.
The entry for Patrick O'Connell is here. He died, well, he was buried on the 4th of March 1959. It states his name. It says here he was 71 years old at the time of burial. He died at St Pancras Hospital because that's where he was brought from. It was his brother who was the only surviving family member.
So for almost 60 years, Patrick O'Connell has been lying here in an unmarked grave. But he hasn't been entirely forgotten, because recently a group of campaigners started working on getting him the recognition he deserves.
Myself and Alan, with a chap called Simon Needham, we founded a supporters club of Real Betis. Alan and Simon had been out in Seville, they'd gone to a Real Betis match, and everybody was talking about this guy Patrick O'Connell, who we didn't know much about. I managed to track down Mike O'Connell, who was Patrick's grandson, and I invited him to basically come and talk about his grandfather Patrick. There was about 900 people at the event, mainly just ordinary football supporters. Mike spoke for about 15 minutes, and at the end of it he explained to us that Patrick was actually buried in an unmarked grave in St Mary's Catholic Cemetery, and you could literally hear a pin drop. We thought, this is shameful, like this man should be remembered in a proper way.
I think he was a very special person, and he showed a special talent as a player, but primarily as a captain as well. He started work at the age of 14 in Boland's flour mills in Dublin, and by the age of 15 he became a foreman. And then it became the natural thing that as soon as he joined a new club, he became the captain. He obviously had special skills in terms of managing people.
You know, without this man and his courage, you know, no O'Connell, no Cruyff, no Iniesta, no Messi. Our main fundraising ideas was to contact former players or current players to donate jerseys.
To auction off?
To auction off to raise funds. And within 2 months we had over 40 jerseys donated from the likes of David Beckham, Gareth Bale, Johan Cruyff, who the majority, I have to say, never heard of Patrick O'Connell. You know, they were quite amazed by the story. Our target was £3,500. Like, to be honest with you, the clubs here could have done this in 5 minutes. You're talking about the biggest clubs in the world.
Mike O'Connell, his grandson, and his wife Sue, who'd been researching Patrick's life for 20-odd years before we met them. They'd been going to the press, TV, and saying, look at this story. And the press and TV, no, not interesting enough.
Maureen O'Sullivan is a member of the Irish Parliament for the neighbourhood where Patrick O'Connell grew up.
Well, there's two stories here. One is obviously the story about Patrick O'Connell. I think the other amazing story is Fergus and Alan and the support group with Mike and Sue, who, you know, started off with just a very simple project to mark the grave with a fitting headstone, and it has developed so many other aspects.
Sadly, Patrick was an alcoholic, so it doesn't seem like he came back home with much money. And Patrick basically, spent his days. He drew national assistance, but begging on the streets of London, and died destitute. Died from pneumonia, age 71, in an attic. This is the man who, is attributed with saving Barcelona, won La Liga, won second division, third division titles, captained one of the probably the biggest club in this country, in England, Manchester United, captained this country, and such a sad ending.
This has come about because of the massive work undertaken by Fergus and Alan, to whom we are truly and completely grateful. I said to Sue before, what do you think he'd have made of this? I think she understands him more than anybody, and I think she came with a really good, straightforward reply. She said he'd have been quite pleased, but would have asked why it took so long. And that's all I can say, really.
As I was listening, I understood that the story of Patrick O'Connell would not just be a story about football, and that to understand the man, we really needed to go back to where it all began, as they say. Fergus and I met up with Maureen in front of the house where Patrick O'Connell grew up more than 120 years ago. But apart from cars and satellite dishes, the street looks pretty much the same.
We contacted Dublin City Council with the idea of getting a plaque at Patrick's property. Now the thing was, nobody exactly knew where Patrick lived. And eventually I tracked Patrick down to 87 Fitzroy Avenue, the family. Yeah. Like, this house is a 2 up, 2 down, and this, he lived here with a family of 12.
Was this pretty average stuff at
well, that was probably quite big. In yes, in the late 19th century.
This was a working class neighbourhood, but not the skilled working.
Not the poorest, because the poorer areas would be more towards city centre, where there were quite a lot of tenements. And
Patrick left school at 14 to work at Boland's flour mill, where he became a foreman already at the age of 15. And although working in a factory at 14 may not sound that great, Patrick was actually one of the lucky ones.
Dublin was a fallen city. This was once the second city of the British Empire in the 18th century. By the early 20th century, it's a city of mass unemployment. About a third of its people are living in tenements. The conditions here are perfectly hellish. If you work in Boland's, you're quite lucky. Boland's, Jacobs, the Guinness Brewery, these are skilled employees. And these are people who have the rarest of things in Dublin, which is a weekly wage. You're a member of the skilled working class, and you're very fortunate. And he certainly was.
The first sign that Patrick O'Connell was something special came when he, 3 years in a row, from 1904 to 06, captained Liffey Wanderers to the Empire Cup, at that time the biggest youth trophy in Ireland.
In these kind of places, football is a part of life. Jacobs Bakeries, they have their own football team, for example. Many people who work in Boland's would have been playing with Liffey Wanderers. So for skilled workers, football was a part of life.
O'Connell lived here, and then, as you say, moved up to Belfast. This was one country.
Yes, indeed it was, and the Irish national team that O'Connell would have played for would have included players from right across the island of Ireland. This is pre-partition Ireland.
And that would have been Catholic and Protestant.
Oh, indeed, absolutely.
Ferguson and the guys have done tremendous work to create awareness about Patrick O'Connell. I mean, they're the reason why that alcove is there. The idea behind the alcoves were it would be a great way to commemorate former players, so that young people, and of course whoever comes into the building, will get a great sense of the history of Irish football. We live in the moment now in professional football. I think particularly, we'll say, in the Premier League and the big clubs, it's about instantaneous success. I think most people agree that the players' wages and agents are you know, the money is really, really big. Sometimes the history can be forgotten, sometimes the history can be forgotten.
Do you know who this guy is?
Oh yeah, he went over to Barcelona.
Do you know him?
The manager, Checo Car.
No, I don't know.
He managed Barcelona, brought them up out of the depths because Franco was Real Madrid man. He was different.
How do you know about this stuff?
Yes.
So we know.
They just want to see the big players.
See the big match now.
I think that there's a problem in the game. Sky Television have come in and have done wonderfully well for football, made it more global. But football did not start then. There were some phenomenal players before that. Just because Sky Television are now run this campaign, I promise you, it did not start in 1991, 92, or when the Premier League started. But try telling that to the younger element nowadays. Doesn't it? Listen, I'm not delving into the past. Patrick's story is a phenomenal story, and anybody who's got a remote interest in football would be thinking it's a great story. Anybody now who feels that Barcelona are one of the great clubs in the world and may not have existed for this man, that's a story in itself.
I go to Dalymount Park, where O'Connell made his debut for Ireland in 1912.
If you go back to when Patrick played here in 1912, Ireland then played football as Ireland. But people would have been extremely close to the pitch. There would have been a small steel fence around the pitch. The crowds were somewhere around 15,000.
Right.
Almost exclusively men. A much more brutal game.
Right.
From what we know, these games, you know, there were far more tackles, far tougher games.
Roy Keane would have done well.
Roy Keane would have done very well, yeah.
In fact, O'Connell became famous when he, in 1914, played most of a match for Ireland with a broken arm, because in those days, substitutes were not allowed.
They weren't well off, and they may have had a certain amount of prestige, and they may have been celebrated as footballers, but they certainly weren't wealthy. They were heroes in their community, but they were ordinary people.
In 1908, at the age of 21, O'Connell gets married to a local girl, Ellen. The very next day, they move north, where O'Connell joins Belfast Celtic. The family story goes that it was an opportune move, let's say, to get out of Dublin where people knew them, seeing as they had a son only 6 months later. In 2015, the famous mural painter Danny Devaney, a former member of the IRA, who got shot several times and took up painting when in prison, painted a mural for the O'Connell campaign.
Danny's a good friend of mine, and I bumped into him in the street one time and he said to me, "Did you ever hear anything about this man, Patrick O'Connell? He was a soccer player, he was an Irish international, he captained Manchester United, but he was in Spain when fascism rose under Franco and he saved the Barcelona club."
Yeah.
So that was my first introduction to him, and I went and read a wee bit.
But have you ever heard the name before?
No, never did.
Why is it interesting for you?
Because I'm interested in history, and I'm interested also in social history. And sometimes when I was at school, history was depicted, and we were taught English history, not Irish history, but it was depicted as, you know, the big people, the generals, the prime ministers, the so-called statesmen, or big battles. Where indeed it's history's small people. History's people like Patrick, when a part of the world was in dire straits, he showed his progressive tendencies. And then
Jerry Adams calls O'Connell progressive, but what do we actually know about the man's politics?
Well, we think everything suggests he was on the left. The family was on the left.
Here's an example of on the left. The three big Republican left football teams in Spain the three biggest Republican socialist teams, Santander, Real Betis, Barcelona. He managed those.
All three.
He was definitely a massive supporter of the Republicans.
The other thing that Boland's Mills is famous for, of course, is that it was a part of the rising in 1916.
Eamon de Valera, the kind of eternal father figure of Irish politics, was in charge of the garrison here in 1916. But when we look at our history, we find, for example, Belfast Celtic's goalkeeper, Oscar Traynor, he fights in the 1916 rising. Right. You know, there are connections between soccer and nationalism.
Oscar Traynor was one of the leaders of the Rising and later for years a central figure in Irish government. But more importantly for our story, a look at the archives indicates that the two knew each other. Some years earlier, Traynor had been the goalkeeper for Belfast Celtic at the same time as Patrick O'Connell had played in central defence. They'd also played in the same youth team back in Dublin. This has given rise to a rumour that also O'Connell was involved.
We heard from a distant relative of Mike's who did run guns. One of the people who went on to be quite important, well, very important, in the first Irish governments was somebody called Oscar Traynor. He went on to be Minister of Posts and Telegraphs in the first Irish government, but he was also a footballer. Now, all the footballers in Dublin would have known each other.
We cannot prove that this is more than a rumour, but a rumour about a gun runner in the family, though, seems to be a curiously precise rumour to appear out of nothing. Sue O'Connell spent 25 years researching her book on her husband's footballing grandfather. As Patrick O'Connell did, Mike's father also left his family. So from the age of 2, Mike actually lived with his grandmother, the wife Patrick O'Connell had left behind.
Most of anything I know about him before 1922 has come from his wife, and that's been passed on to Sue. From the age of 2, I was brought up by my granny, his wife, and one of her daughters.
One thing that is certain is that Patrick O'Connell was a man who stood up for his rights.
And there he is down there. There he is.
As we found out when we meet Martin Buchan, another former Man United captain.
1914.
It turns out that Patrick O'Connell in fact was one of the first members of the Players' Union more than 100 years ago, which was why the PFA financially supported the campaign to give him a proper headstone.
Led first place strike in 1909.
The owners of the clubs, the directors,
Treated them like serfs.
the job of this association was to basically take care of the footballers, right?
Yeah, it was just so that the players could have rights, employment rights like other people.
Like a trade
I mean, some of them were, they were actually locked out of the clubs when they found out that they'd formed a union.
They were locked, they were basically...
Yeah. And there's an old photograph, and they're in the various kits, and it's called the Outcasts. There would have been comparatively good wages, but they would go to training, public transport. They wouldn't be driving their own cars. And as you can see, the next entry would have been 1919 after the Great War finished.
So the league was basically suspended, wasn't it, during the wartime?
Yeah, well, they were all
right.
joined up and fighting.
Yeah.
The war, of course, soon turned into a trench massacre, and to boost public morale, the Army and the FA established so-called footballers' battalions, army units made up of professional and famous footballers. But Patrick O'Connell really didn't fancy joining his teammates. It could be that the Irishman O'Connell simply didn't want to fight for the British Army, although his grandson doesn't seem to think that was the reason.
So my gran told me that to avoid having to go and fight, Patrick went into munitions, so he went into a Dagenham Ford factory. That's how he ended up down there.
Right. So you went to make the munitions in order to...
Not fight in the war.
As money got tight, the differences between himself and Ellen shone through.
The marriage had been failing for a while.
So she is an intellectual. He is a working class, one of 12 plodding lads who happens to be good at football, who's into saving money. He made it clear that what was wrong with his wife, she didn't treat money properly.
In 1914, after 5 totally unremarkable seasons in Hull and Sheffield, O'Connell joins Manchester United. He's Britain's most expensive player at that point, and he's made captain. But the war soon brings football to a halt and would rob O'Connell of the best years of his career. In 1915, United were to play Liverpool, and the bookmakers were giving great odds on a 2-0 victory to United.
O'Connell, it seems, made contact with his opposite number in Liverpool. He arranged to fix the match. O'Connell sold the idea on the basis that this was the second last match of the season. The certainty was there was going to be no football the following season, and as professional footballers, they didn't know when, if ever, they would be able to resume their professional career. So they arranged to fix the game. Everything was working to plan until the last few minutes when somebody forgot the plot. He nearly broke his leg, and the referee, while loath to do so, had no alternative but to whistle for a penalty. And O'Connell, by all accounts, strode forward, dismissing the usual penalty taker, said, "I will deal with this," put the ball down, kicked it 4 or 5 yards wide and at least 4 feet over the cross. So it was described subsequently as the worst struck penalty in modern football history. This going back then. It was so bad. Stewart's inquiry followed. A number of players were suspended, but not O'Connell. And that gave me an insight into the makeup of O'Connell. Not alone was he a fixer and a reasonably good footballer, but he was a very astute man and knew when to get out and when to duck and dive.
This is the beginning, but after you make the piece of work, it is not just finished then, it has to go for 3
The campaign has brought in more money than expected, so Alan and Fergus have decided to have a bronze bust of O'Connell made. The bust will later in the year be handed over to Real Betis in Spain.
Now, Picasso was doing that, he'd say that's finished. But I can't get away with that. He'd say that's finished. He'd put a hat on top and say, that's Michael O'Connell. You've got the hands of me, put it around, my hands are yours. Just put the hand.
Get it at the right angle. There we go.
You see, if you have a hat on it, you see, because that's not the right size, because I don't know the size of the head. Put it up there.
Right. Very strong.
Yeah.
Facial.
Well, reading the thing about him, he really wasn't a very nice man. As such, he wasn't. You wouldn't say he became a saint. He was a stern man.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like he would be the Alex Ferguson of his day, I'd say.
Absolutely.
He got things done.
Yeah, there was no
messing. There was no messing. That's what I'm saying.
None at all.
Yeah, yeah.
In August 1919, O'Connell arrives here to Dumbarton, 30 kilometers west of Glasgow. It's a difficult time. His marriage is coming to an end, and so is his playing career. He needs, as we would say today, a new start.
He played there for 1 season, but they didn't live there for the whole season. The wife and the children came back to Manchester, but Patrick stayed in Scotland. And after that,
proud to be a son of Dumbarton, for it's a royal borough sitting on the Clyde. It's a gateway.
I meet up with a couple of proper football nerds, they won't be offended by that term, who tell me that football in Scotland after the First World War actually was quite an exciting proposition.
So Scotland was at a cutting edge, late 19th century, in changing the way association football was played. The game was quite different. In Scotland, the lauded game was the short passing game. The ball was weaved forward and quick, short passes. So O'Connell's part of that experience coming to Dumbarton, and he's clearly a good enough player when he comes to Dumbarton as well to get straight into the team, to lead the team.
Money in Scottish football was tight, and out of season they simply wouldn't get paid. So in the summer of 1920, O'Connell worked in the shipyard in Dumbarton, handling gigantic machines like this one, a plate bending roll. Try suggesting that to players today.
What I find interesting about Patrick O'Connell's centre-half as well, it's not the centre-half that we think of today, you know, the stopper centre-half that you think of today, that there was a big solitary defender, man marking the centre-forward, and the centre-half was more of an expressive player. And so he would be actually a very important link within a formation at that particular time. He's a captain as well, he's leader on the field.
Later in Spain, O'Connell would always stress exactly this. His teams making a quick transition from defence to attack, and it seems that the seeds were sown here in Scotland. Unfortunately, O'Connell, who only 6 years earlier had been Britain's most expensive player, did not live up to expectations. The potato famine had forced massive immigration, and by 1919, 250,000 Catholic, Irish-born or second-generation Irish were living in Protestant Scotland.
I think generally you could probably say that the Irish weren't welcome at all. But the biggest thing in terms of prejudice, bigotry, sectarianism, discrimination against the Irish, against Catholics, was there was an official Church of Scotland campaign that ran, and it was very virulently anti-Catholic. So invariably O'Connell would have experienced it, encountered it, been aware of it. There's no way he wouldn't have.
Scotland was, of course, an integral part of the British Empire, while Ireland at the same time was fighting for independence. And Celtic always played a special role.
Celtic have always been primarily a football team. That's what the club is about. But they were started by Irish-born and second-generation Irish. Many of those men involved were themselves Irish nationalists. People who went to see the club, who played for the club, would be Irish nationalist-minded.
Knowing both the highs and the lows of football, Bertie Auld was taken in by Patrick O'Connell's story and has supported the campaign from the very first day.
You would get your old trousers on and your sand shoes on and you would go down the street. If you're poor, you can still play football. That would keep your mind off of the hunger that you had in your tummy.
Before Fergus mentioned Patrick O'Connell, had you ever heard about Patrick O'Connell?
Never heard about him at all. I saw a photograph of him and he looked magnificent, very fresh and bright eyes. He was very alert, very strong-willed personality and brightness. And for an Irishman to finish up abroad.
Bertie still remembers the advice the manager gave him the day he signed his first contract.
Listen, son, see if you can play and entertain. The support, I'll never ever forget you. And that was 1955. What's this year? And I promise you I could be on anywhere in the world. Now, it's a way of life. I've loved the life that I've had. And I love the people that's made it possible, and that's the people that's came and watched me. That's the people that can still want to speak to you, you know what I mean? But then all of a sudden the support came into it, and that's where they were.
Right.
They gave us this, for it's a grand old team to play for. And they would just lift us, and I promise you, you're in another world.
Is football good enough taking care of its history?
I think the idea of somebody having played football before Messi and Ronaldo and various other superstars of the modern game, it's absolutely critical and vital that people remember them and young people know about them. And I think particularly they need to know that the vast majority of people that ever represented their football clubs, they played for virtually nothing. And maybe as well, you know, the way football is going today, there is in fact too much money in the game. And the too much money is ending up in so few pockets. You know, so the fans, the supporters, they have to pay over the odds to support their teams. One of the great ironies has been that around about the year that Celtic was founded, the lavishness around what we would call today George Square and the civic buildings around that area were opened. And yet, only a few hundred yards away, some of the greatest poverty existing in Europe at the time. You could walk around Glasgow and a number of British cities and you see all these figures, you know, lauded for their imperialism, and probably Patrick O'Connell and some people like him are more deserving of the statue in George Square than some of the characters in there.
Patrick O'Connell left Scotland after only 1 year, and he went to Northern England, to Ashington in the 3rd Division.
Do you know the story of the photograph on the wall?
No.
We go to Ashington and we arranged to meet the historian. Sue arranged to meet the historian of Ashington. And as we're walking along on this huge long wall, there's a photograph about this big. And it's Patrick O'Connell. And I get to the bar and I say to the welcome and say, I said, do you know that photo? He goes, he says, no, it's been there for donkey's years. So I said, that's the only bloke that's ever managed Ashington and Barcelona. Which was true.
Ashington is a mining town with a proud football history, the birthplace of Jackie Milburn and Bobby and Jack Charlton. But where Ashington's ground used to be, there is now a supermarket. And at Ashington's impressive new stadium, there is little sign of Patrick O'Connell. I guess that being the only man to have managed both Ashington and Barcelona doesn't guarantee that they'll keep your photo on the wall. A few miles down the road we find Blythe Spartans, where Fergus, Alan and Simon started their campaign to resurrect Patrick O'Connell 4 years ago. O'Connell spent 2 years at Ashington here in the northeast of England, the first year as a player, the second as a player-manager. It was a far cry from Manchester United.
There's a phrase which you hear even now, that the northeast is a hotbed of football. In those days that was absolutely the case. The football was an escape. So unless you were really bright, went to grammar school or some such, you're pretty much destined to go down the mine if you lived in Northumberland. Following the First World War, there had been a mini economic boom, but quite soon that wasn't the case, and the miners had a wage reduction imposed upon them between 10 and 40%. Now that sucks a lot of money out of a local economy, and times were very tough in this area. The effect on football was that the clubs couldn't pay as much. The fans couldn't pay to come and watch it.
So basically, when O'Connell came up here in 1920, that was as you said, there had been a boom, but it was pretty bad timing, really.
Very bad timing.
There wasn't any money, so people weren't going to the matches, and he really wasn't needed. And that's when he went off to Spain. In Ashington, he is supposed to have been having some sort of a relationship with the daughter of one of the directors of the club. Oof. And so it was, yeah. And so perhaps it was useful for him to leave Ashington as well. So he might have had an irate father after him.
So he's a bit of a womanizer.
For a while after he'd left, O'Connell would occasionally send his family money from Spain.
He left them with very little money. He sent money for a short while. In an envelope. Yeah, it came in an envelope for a short time.
I guess it's 18 months or something.
O'Connell sailed from Northumberland in the autumn of 1922. Whether he left because of an affair, or lack of football, or lack of money, maybe a combination of it all, we don't exactly know.
What we do know is that O'Connell now abandoned his family, his wife, and 4 small children, and that apart from a brief, cold encounter with one of his sons 30 years later, he never saw them again. And that in November 1922, Patrick O'Connell arrives here to northern Spain, to the city of Santander.
No doubt O'Connell, after Northumberland, would have been struck by the palatial houses, the palm trees, and the sunshine. O'Connell lived near the square, which hasn't changed much since then, full of kids and football. In fact, this is where Real Racing Santander Football Club originally was founded. In Santander, O'Connell would reinvent himself, but you have to wonder whether he wasn't also thinking about the family he'd left behind. At the charming Magdalena Palace, Raúl Samperio tells me about the Santander O'Connell arrived to in 1922.
De crecimiento, ¿no? Es una ciudad que aproximadamente tendría 90, 100.000 habitantes, con el puerto de Santander. La gente de Cantabria se iba a América y desarrollaban o destinaban parte de su fortuna en sus casas, en sus pueblos, creaban iglesias, creaban escuelas y desde luego hay una cosa que estimula muchísimo a la ciudad, que es la presencia del rey en Santander y el impulso al turismo, ¿no?
For Patrick O'Connell, though, the Magdalena Palace would have an even more personal significance.
Los reyes de España tenían unos infantes y contrataron a una institutriz, era Ellen, era irlandesa, para que les enseñara a hablar inglés. Conoció a O'Connell, se enamoraron y se llegaron a casar. No conocemos mucha historia sobre esa relación porque era una relación íntima y muy personal y Patrick O'Connell no era precisamente de las personas que hablaba de su vida, ¿no? Seguramente estaría aquí porque visitaría a Ellen durante su estancia.
It seems that O'Connell told Ellen, who was a devout Catholic, that he was a widower. At this point, La Liga still didn't exist, but Racing under O'Connell won the regional league 5 times in a row. And therefore, in 1929, when La Liga starts, little provincial Racing is there, together with Madrid and Barcelona.
Claro, si no llega a ser por O'Connell, yo estoy completamente seguro que el Racing no hubiera conseguido eso que para los racinguistas es lo más memorable que ha tenido el equipo. O'Connell, aunque sea un personaje olvidado, a la gente que nos gusta la historia y a la gente que nos gusta reconocer un poco las cosas, pues es para nosotros un personaje muy importante.
The club's historian tells me that O'Connell actually came to Santander on the suggestion of his predecessor, Frederick Pentland.
Mr. Pentland, cuando se marcha de Santander, aconseja al Racing. Os aconsejo a este que le conozco, buena persona, tal. Claro, el fútbol aquí venía de Inglaterra. Entonces, un inglés, un irlandés, lo mejor de lo mejor. Muy bien vestido, ¿vale? Muy buena presencia, con el sombrerito típico y demás. Muy serio, era tímido porque no hablaba el idioma, normal. Pero pronto empezó ya a identificarse con Santander. Él bebía mucho, le gustaba mucho la bebida. En España se usaba mucho la calidad, el talento de cada uno. Sí. Si eres bueno o eres malo, en función a si sabes manejar un balón. Pero llega O'Connell, llegan todos los británicos y marcan mucho el trabajo físico, la importancia del trabajo físico en el fútbol y también el trabajo en equipo. O sea, que el fútbol es un deporte de 11, no de 1 o de 2. Sí. Es curioso porque O'Connell estuvo viviendo los primeros 3 años de O'Connell aquí en Santander, sí. Estuvo viviendo en una pensión al lado del ayuntamiento con el jugador más famoso del Racing, Óscar. Pero era muy curiosa la situación porque Óscar era sordo. O sea, añade esto a un hombre que no habla español con otro que oye muy mal. Pues imagínate. Sí. Pues hicieron mucha amistad. En España somos muy dados a las bromas y chistes y demás, sí. ¿No? Incluso en 1925, en noviembre, se casa Óscar, su mejor amigo. En el convite de boda, Óscar le dice a los camareros, oye, no, en la copa de vino no pongáis vino, por favor. Vino no, agua y agua.
Incluso O'Connell jugaba algunos partidos, ¿no?
Sí, hombre, era habitual. Las plantillas eran muy cortas, no había como hoy 25 jugadores. Entonces el Racing pensó, para hacer más fuerte el equipo, ¿por qué no hacemos que el míster juegue? Con 40 años, O'Connell tenía 40 años ya. Tenía calidad todavía, claro. Entonces, claro, pues, de hecho, él arbitraba también partidos de fútbol aquí.
¿Ah, sí?
Sí, al Racing no, ¿eh?
No, claro.
Él aquí ganaba al mes 1.000 pesetas cuando llegó.
¿Y es al nivel de quién? ¿Un profesor o más?
Yo creo que era un sueldo bastante respetable. Los futbolistas de la época iban muy bien vestidos todos, con lo cual sí. O'Connell también lo iba bien vestido.
When O'Connell took over in 1922, Racing was still a small provincial club. With him they qualified for La Liga, but today the club is back in the 3rd division.
Los 7 años que estuvo con él al principio los ganó siempre. Todo fue un desarrollo, todo siempre progresivo, hacia arriba. No hubo ni siquiera un bajón, nada.
One of the reasons for O'Connell's success wherever he worked was his focus on finding and nurturing young talent.
Este es el New Racing, sí. Este es 1923 y el entrenador era también O'Connell.
Que es aquí era realmente famoso, ¿no?
Aquí es donde empezó O'Connell ya, es que el rey.
¿Es la primera vez que...?
No es la primera vez, pero tampoco te puedo decir algo concreto.
Yo le conocí una vez en un viaje que hice a Belfast, en Irlanda, y vi el mural allí, y vi el escudo del Racing, con el del Betis. No lo sabía, no. Es importante conocer la historia para saber lo que tenemos y valorar lo que hemos tenido también.
Lo que pasa es que estamos acostumbrados a acordarnos de los últimos 20 años, últimos 20 jugadores, pero ha habido entrenadores del Racing que no nos acordamos y han sido más importantes que los que estamos viendo ahora. Sin ellos no seríamos hoy. Se tenía que fomentar un poco más, poner placas, fotos,
homenajes.
Nevertheless, in 1929, Racing is no longer convinced that O'Connell can take them any further, and he's fired. For the next 18 months, he works a bit further along the coast in 2nd Division Real Oviedo. There, one day, a muscular 18-year-old kid walks in. His name was Isidro Langara. O'Connell spends 20 minutes on the pitch with him and signs him immediately.
Well, Langara is possibly the best Spanish striker in history that people don't know about. Very clear sense of him as being physically incredibly imposing, a brilliant finisher, a very, very good goal scorer. It's been a player who's been described to me before as a kind of a Cristiano Ronaldo of his age, but certainly we're talking about someone who was probably the outstanding player of his generation.
But the club's directors disagree. Langara is clumsy, they say. They demand that O'Connell plays another striker. The Irishman tells them that Langara is an unpolished diamond and that he will play him. Here in Langara's own words, 5 decades later.
Hubo un entrenador en el Oviedo, un irlandés llamado Patricio O'Connell, que decía que tenía unas grandes condiciones para jugar de extremo, y por fin salió con la suya y acabé jugando de extremo derecha en el Oviedo.
I think one of the themes that reappears repeatedly with O'Connell is that he was very stubborn and he had a very clear sense of what it was he wanted to achieve, a real assuredness in what he does and a real sense that, okay, look, you brought me here because I know, so you let me do it and I will do it my way and I'll push it, and if that involves creating tension in relationships, then so be it. That O'Connell found a guy that people were not that aware of, thought that he saw something in him, thought that he saw a goal scorer in him, which perhaps wasn't always the case, and kind of pushed him in a, I wouldn't quite call it a paternal sense, but pushed him in the sense of saying, right, you can do things that even you don't know you can do.
O'Connell was right, of course. Langara would go on to be top scorer in Spain for 3 seasons, with an incredible average of almost a goal and a half per match. But O'Connell's relations with the club directors had been ruined, and soon after he left. He didn't need to worry though, his star was on the rise. In Santander, O'Connell had become close friends with one of the club directors, José María de Cosillo, a leading Spanish intellectual. And this would be a pattern. During his years in Spain, the uneducated lad from Dublin would make close friends with a series of intellectuals.
Cosillo, sobre todo, es un gran intelectual de las letras españolas, ¿no? Fue muy amigo de los poetas jóvenes, con poetas como García Lorca, Gerardo Diego, Luis Cernuda, en fin, muy amigo de toreros y muy amigo de futbolistas. Veréis alguna fotografía de O'Connell vestido de torero, con una capa, ¿no? O'Connell le encantaba eso de estar allí. Bueno, le gustaba también beber, era un buen bebedor. Era un buen bebedor.
¿Es un rumor o es
No, eso también lo comenta. Cosillo también ayudó a O'Connell para, digamos, en su carrera profesional como entrenador, ¿no? Entonces, aquí tengo una carta del Fútbol Club Barcelona, pedirle referencias sobre Patrick O'Connell, porque ya el Barcelona quería ficharle a principios de los años 30, ¿no? Entonces, le ayuda a redactar en castellano una carta que el Barcelona le pide a O'Connell. No solicite sino los gastos justos de mi trabajo en Barcelona. Lo mismo en Santander que en Oviedo, he venido ganando la cantidad de 1.000 pesetas mensuales y no tengo más aspiración con ustedes.
Para él el trabajo, el puesto en Barcelona es más interesante, más importante que el dinero, ¿no?
Claro, en este caso sí, hombre, también el Barcelona es uno de los grandes equipos también en aquella época y es una proyección para su carrera.
O'Connell did not land the Barca job at this point in 1931, but Barca's interest was of course a clear indication of how well he was doing, and he would eventually come to play a major role in the history of the club. Back in Dublin, Joe's bust of O'Connell is ready to go into the kiln. A mould has been made of the clay bust and boiling bronze is being poured.
It's really a collection, it's a story inspired by Patrick. Patrick's story sparked the idea. To make it work in the modern day context, I had to look at the Guardiolas and the Mourinhos and how they dressed. And I think what I also found very interesting was in Spanish football culture, how players refer to their manager as Mr. And I think Patrick was the first manager actually that was known as El Mister. I think they used to call him El Mister. And that habit is alive today.
Other artists have also been inspired. A Gaelic football legend turned clothes designer has named his latest collection Mr. after O'Connell.
You have to consider that you take someone like Gary Neville, who went down to Valencia 2 years ago, struggled, didn't last very long. Like Patrick went down there in the 30s, had no real experience of Spanish football, and won La Liga. And you know, I think he's a funny character. Like there's obviously a fearlessness to him, and a strength to him, and a bravery to him, and a courage to him, and a lot of character to him. But then you have the other side of him just leaving his family, which would suggest the opposite kind of qualities, you know. So,
do you think that also plays a role?
Yeah, I think it probably does. I think it must have been very tough on his family, and that kind of thing. I think Irish people don't want to really go near that or talk about that. I think it probably makes us a bit uncomfortable. I just thought How did I not know about this? How have I not heard about this before? Amazing story.
The campaign started by asking famous players to sign football strips to be auctioned off to pay for O'Connell's headstone.
And to be honest with you, nobody had ever heard of this man. Anybody we spoke to. Johan Cruyff, within 24 hours, had signed a jersey and sent a signed book. And from there, it just escalated to people like Figo, Maldini, Beckenbauer, Sir Bobby Charlton, Dennis Law, Gordon Banks. We had the Lisbon Lions from Manchester City with Mike Summerby and Colin Bell, and David Beckham sent his short from London, signed short. Just incredible. I mean, Pele, we got in touch with the Brazilian embassy here. He sent a jersey.
Pele sent a jersey?
Yeah.
The other part of the story to me is the story of what Alan and Fergus have done, and it has just been absolutely incredible, and I think at times it has taken over their lives completely.
Before the bust is taken to Spain, it is revealed at Windsor Park in Belfast.
Just like to thank the Irish Football Association, Patrick Nelson and Assistant Manager Jimmy Nicholas for coming today for the unveiling.
Wow. Hand on the heart, had you heard about Patrick O'Connell?
No, and the more I hear the story, the more ashamed I am that I didn't know. And then when I heard the Man United connection, and then when I heard about the things he did for Barca, I mean, really, we should know these things. It takes a bit of courage, to go out and be confident in your ability. I'm going to go over there and prove that I can do this, that, and the other. Listen, the greatest feeling in the world is running out in front of 50,000 people, and if you're playing well, it's great, you know. And then when you don't have that, also being booed by 50,000 people on a regular basis as well, but at least it's something. Right. And you miss all that, you know. So when you finally finish playing football, and the game turns its back on you, I mean, really, what Patrick went through, and it should never happen. Put it like that. I haven't been to the Man United museum. I hope in the museum there's some sort of appreciation and recognition for him. I hope so.
I think it's limited as far as I've heard.
Well, is that right? Okay. Well, it shouldn't be. And
but in striking contrast to other of O'Connell's clubs, Manchester United has in fact shown rather limited interest.
We met a chap called Tony Denton, who's an artist. He had done this fantastic painting of Patrick wearing his Irish cap from the British Home Championship victory in 1914, which is behind you, yeah.
We have this painting here today because that was the original that he painted, but also he painted the same portrait which now hangs in Camp Nou in Barcelona.
Barcelona Football Club had endorsed the project in February 2015, and we presented the painting to the president, and now it's there. And it's actually hanging in Camp Nou in the board of directors boardroom.
In the painting, O'Connell is wearing his island cap from 1914.
Mike O'Connell, Patrick's grandson, brought the cap with him, and the reason that this cap still survives to this day is that Patrick's first wife kept this cap as a tea cosy. When Mike O'Connell produced this cap and held it out towards the president of Barcelona Football Club and says, "This is the very cap from 1914 which is in this portrait," the president of FC Barcelona said, "May I touch it?" And I think this just shows one example of how Patrick O'Connell is revered not only by Barcelona Football Club, but by many others.
Tony Denton also made a series of 4 paintings of the only 4 Irish captains of Manchester United, O'Connell being the first and the latest one Roy Keane. But the reaction from Man United was less than enthusiastic.
We arranged to bring the paintings to Mr. Keane to show them, and he was actually quite taken. We spent a half an hour with him in a sort of private room in the team hotel. So myself and Alan then had the idea to contact Manchester United Football Club. They initially accepted, but had done a U-turn and had refused the paintings.
Maybe nowadays the history of some of the football clubs is being put to the background in favour of more commercialism.
When we ourselves approached Manchester United, we were asked a fee of £1,000 for morning's filming in their museum. Quite the contrast.
The people that are now running football, I think they're more interested in times for Asian television, for short selling, that sort of thing, rather than the players that have gone before. It's a shame because Patrick's story is one that really should be told.
Finally, Don Patricio and his ever-expanding group of supporters have arrived to Seville. At the match later that evening, the bust will be presented to Betis on the pitch. But before that, on one of the few rainy days here, we venture out to look for Don Patricio in the Seville of the early 1930s. The Irishman O'Connell fell in love with Seville and would in total spend almost 20 years in the city.
Seville today is much as it was 4 centuries ago, and anyone would have it so. For although some main avenues are wide and modern, it is like entering another world to stroll through any one of the streets where the atmosphere of the past is still alive.
But real Spain was of course more than this American tourist image. It was backwards and owned by a small elite. For most, it was still a very hard life. Change, radical change, was in the air.
Estamos en lo que es el barrio del Porvenir. Se construye aproximadamente en los años 20 del siglo pasado. Es una zona de expansión urbana moderna de Sevilla.
Many members of the board of the club and many players and people related to the club usually lived here in El Porvenir.
Era un barrio de un relativo posicionamiento económico elevado porque son todo construcciones unifamiliares y casitas.
Madrid, Barcelona, every town and hamlet filled the streets in one vast, delirious demonstration of delight to mark the birth of the Republic and their newly won liberties. Drunk with enthusiasm, they danced the fandango, sang the Marseillaise.
In 1931, the Socialists and Republicans won the elections, kicked out the king, and embarked on sweeping social and educational reforms.
Should some be yelling, down with the monarchy, death to the king, death to the queen, viva la Republic.
En 1932 y prácticamente durante gran parte del periodo republicano, Sevilla es una ciudad bastante convulsa. Es una ciudad donde de hecho se le denominaba Sevilla la Roja.
A bit down the road we are joined by another Betis gentleman and historian, Enrique Añino. Enrique lives in the very same building where the O'Connells lived in the 1930s.
We are very pleased to introduce you Mr. Enrique Añino. His father was one of the founders of the club, so for us it's also a pleasure to have Enrique here with us. In Seville, that kind of house is very common, especially in the historical city. It's called a patio de vecinos. It's a court of neighbors.
Enrique was born at the time when O'Connell lived in the neighborhood, and his father was a friend of O'Connell through many years.
Sí. Pero O'Connell vivía aquí en el barrio 15 años, ¿sí? Sí. ¿Y el barrio era para Sevilla o para Betis?
Aquí normalmente era del Betis, sobre todo cuando fue campeón. Era más del Betis.
Enrique's father was for many years in charge of the club's finances and would travel to all matches at O'Connell's side.
2 hombres para poner hierro de la bandera, 5, 1 peseta. 11 jerseys verdes de Libertad, 42.90.
Tu padre y Don Patricio eran amigos.
Sí, ¿no? Y mi padre aquí con la pajarita.
¿Y el mister aquí?
El mister ahí.
Sí.
Y es el único recuerdo como tal que hay del Betis, conmemoración que hay del Betis de esos años, no hay otra cosa. Él siempre va a hablar de que al fútbol había que jugarlo con velocidad, Tenía la facultad de rápidamente hacer una transición muy rápida de la defensa a la delantera y ser muy resolutivo.
In interviews, his players describe O'Connell as a general, stressing discipline and physical strength. Another article mentions that O'Connell, at this point in his mid-40s, always does the training of his goalkeepers himself, as, quote, "Nobody can kick the ball as hard and precisely as the Irishman can." O'Connell didn't give many interviews, but when he did, he always stressed the importance of speed, of body and thought. If a player is slow in understanding the game, I suggest that he dedicates himself to chess instead, O'Connell told a newspaper.
Su fútbol es un fútbol físico y basado durante el triunfo en la fortaleza defensiva. En 22 partidos solo recibe 19 goles. Era muy efectivo el equipo.
Before their last match against O'Connell's former team Santander, Betis was neck and neck with the mighty Madrid. There is a story that O'Connell met his former players the night before the match and tried to persuade them not to try too hard. In the end, Betis won 5-0 and were champions for the first time ever.
Es el primer equipo que rompe el monopolio que hasta entonces habían tenido el Barcelona, el Athletic de Bilbao y el Real Madrid, que eran los únicos equipos que habían ganado la Liga. La prensa durante la temporada 35 nunca cree que el Betis vaya a ganar la Liga. El Betis ya fallará, pero van pasando las jornadas y no fallan.
Football was quite different back then. During the season, Betis drove 18,000 kilometers around Spain, often being on the road 4 days for one match. And after the last match, they had to go and pick up the trophy themselves from the previous champions in Bilbao, where the local fans, though, gave them a hero's welcome. Another 3 days of driving brought the team home to massive celebrations in Seville. In many ways, this was the original Leicester story. O'Connell had built the team from scratch, brought them up from the second division, and now they were champions. The only time ever Betis has won the championship was with Don Patricio. Not that that diminishes the enthusiasm of Los Beticos, recognized as some of the most enthusiastic fans anywhere. Before the match, the guys want to present the bust of O'Connell to the Beticos. The bar is run by the Bomberos, the firemen, who have their own Betis fan club here.
Hola amigos, gracias a los bomberos, gracias a los aficionados de Real Betis. Cuando Patricio volvió a Londres, siempre pensó a España y más que nada de familia de Real Betis. Gracias.
For us, Mr. O'Connell was very, very important in our history, and for us it's very, very important to have this present. Thank you very much.
título con el que fuimos campeones de liga en 1973, realizado en el mármol verde que conmemora por Joan Morata. Es elaborado por Marc Bacone y un código de participación en los términos del Papi Bacone Memorial Foundation. Muchas gracias.
¿Sabéis quién es el único entrenador que ha ganado la Liga para el Betis?
Sí, el irlandés que salió antes.
¿Cómo se llama?
Es que no me acuerdo, sé que no sé cuánto capo.
Don Patricio.
Eso.
¿Y sabéis cuándo lo ganó?
En 1900 y pico.
In Betis, they celebrate Patrick O'Connell as the man who won them their only ever championship in 1935. But if you thought that O'Connell's story couldn't get any more extraordinary, you'd be wrong. Because here, in FC Barcelona, one of the biggest clubs in the whole world, some say that O'Connell was the man who saved Barca. In December 2015, the guys behind the campaign presented a painting of O'Connell made by Tony Denton to the president of FC Barcelona. Today that painting hangs in Barca's boardroom. But none of the Barca fans we asked at the match that night knew anything about the Irishman.
Y eres socio, ¿eh?
Sí, socio número 1100.
1100, eres socio muchos años, ¿no?
Sí.
Patrick O'Connell. ¿Sabes quién era? Patrick O'Connell, un entrenador irlandés.
No.
No, Don Patricio, ¿sabes quién era?
No.
No,
pero hace muchos años, lo sé.
No me suena.
Pero usted me habla de 80 años para atrás.
Sí.
El trabajo que tengo para acordarme que soy casado y ahora me quieres que ver de eso.
Muy bien. I was lucky enough to talk to Carlos Santacana, a university historian who also works at FC Barcelona's very own documentation center.
Se hizo muy famoso en España entrenando al Racing, pero también entrenando sobre todo al Betis. Y que un club que no era de los grandes y en cambio consiguió su mayor trofeo precisamente con él de entrenador. Entonces eso le dio mucha fama.
O'Connell's first year at Barca, the season 1935-36, was surprisingly successful. With a very young team, they nevertheless reached the Spanish Cup final, which they lost 2-1 to Madrid.
Era muy profesional, entonces exigía mucho a los jugadores, pero al mismo tiempo les estimulaba muy bien.
All spring 1936, confrontation is brewing in Spain. Wide-sweeping socialist reforms were angering many rich, the church, and parts of the army. In June 36, O'Connell and Ellen leave for holidays to Ireland. Only 1 month later, Franco's troops attack, and soon after, Barca's president Sunyol, the man who had hired O'Connell, is killed. In September 36, Barca sends O'Connell a telegram that, due to the war, he's under no obligation to return, and that the club cannot guarantee to pay his salary because the Spanish league has been suspended.
pero él considera que debe incorporarse, tiene un compromiso profesional con el club y él viene a Barcelona.
Es difícil imaginarse ahora, ¿no? Hoy en día, ¿no? Que un entrenador decidió volver a una zona bélica.
Es llamativo que él no quisiera venir a Barcelona. No podemos olvidar que justo al inicio de la guerra el presidente del Barça, que era un diputado de Esquerra Republicana, fue asesinado los primeros días por tropas fascistas.
The symbolism of Sunyol's assassination is hugely powerful, and what that must have felt like to those left behind in Barcelona, it must have been terrifying, very, very powerful as well.
British journalist and historian Sid Lowe has intimately studied FC Barcelona and its president Sunyol.
He has a political presence, he has a presence as president of Barcelona, but not just president of Barcelona, but as a journalist who wrote specifically and explicitly about the social dimension of sport and what it means, which by definition makes him an enemy of what is becoming the Francoist New State. Obviously at this stage it's not yet the Francoist New State, but that threat is there and it's very real and it's very, very concerning. So I don't think for a minute that O'Connell would have had any doubts that Barcelona were in a dangerous position. And then of course what happens is that the proposal that really thrusts him into this role of kind of participating in saving Barcelona or taking Barcelona away out of harm's way, obviously by definition also takes him out of harm's way.
Day by day, Franco's troops are encroaching on Barcelona, supported by Hitler's and Mussolini's bomber planes. It was then that the idea of a tour abroad arose, to make money for the club and to tell the world about Franco's attack on Spanish democracy. This was the tour which would earn O'Connell the nickname the Savior of Barça.
Se cumplieron varios objetivos diferentes, ¿no? Un objetivo deportivo, un objetivo económico y también un objetivo político, ¿no? Eso quiere decir muy pocos ingresos. Claro, el club se va, digamos, endeudando, ¿no? Al empezar la guerra y ir reduciéndose las competiciones, muchos socios jóvenes tienen que ir a la guerra, dejan de pagar sus cuotas de socio. Y claro, México era uno de los países que apoyaba de una manera más decidida a la República, ¿no? Su presidente, Lázaro Cárdenas, estaba muy implicado, incluso personalmente. Facilitar una gira que pudiera, pues, tener un objetivo deportivo, pero también de propaganda en favor de la República. Entonces, vieron que
there was just one problem. The team's physio couldn't go to Mexico. So O'Connell had to improvise. He'd heard that one of the groundsmen had an interest in physiotherapy, so he asked him to join the trip. Don't worry, he assured him, what you don't know, I'll teach you on board the boat. Ángel Moore Jr., the physio's son, tells me the story.
Pero que mi padre hablaba muy bien del señor O'Connell y que hablaron con él y mi padre y le dijo, pues nada, venga usted con nosotros. Claro, mi padre dijo, oiga, que yo, claro, golpes y todas estas cosas no estoy. Y dijo, no se preocupe, en aquella época que todo era más fácil. Y esa es la forma de que como mi padre más o menos empezó con el señor O'Connell.
In just one day, just before the team left for Mexico, 1,200 people were killed by Italian and German bombers. Ángel Moore Sr. said, we could stay in Barcelona and get blown up, or we could go to Mexico. It was an easy choice.
Salimos de aquí en el mes de mayo, 17 de mayo.
When Ángel Moore Sr. retired, his son took over as physio for both Barça and Spain. So for 35 years, Ángel took care of the legs of Cruyff, Maradona and Messi, but also becoming an important spiritual part of the team. Ángel showed me where the O'Connells used to live, nice, although nothing particularly fancy. And just like in Betis, O'Connell chose to live just a stone throw from the stadium. Today, of course, there's a whole little army around a top football team, taking care of the players' every need. but the Barca group leaving for Mexico consisted of only 20 men, 16 players, an O'Connell, an assistant manager, a club director, and the physio Ángel Moore Sr.
El señor O'Connell, que era el jefe, yo creo que tuvo que hacer de todo, de portero, de medio volante, de camarero, de masajista, doctor, de salidas, hotel. Yo me parecía con mucho carácter, que tuvo que marchar de allí, de Inglaterra, de irle por problemas, matrimonio, mujer, marchar y tal. Hay que tener un carácter especial. Eso es lo único.
Bringing in physiotherapy in the 1930s is another example of O'Connell being far ahead of his time.
Como métodos que había entonces, si te acuerdas, y has oído a tu abuela y a mi abuela, cuando alguien tenía algo en un tobillo que se torcía, te decían, pon el pie en agua caliente, con sal y vinagre. Y entonces con esto ya está. Entonces el tobillo hacía así. Y decían, ¿ves? Ya sale el derrame.
¿Ah, sí?
Claro,
es algo bueno.
Claro, ya ha salido, estaba ahí, pero ha salido.
¿El fútbol recuerda bien sus anteriores jugadores?
No, este es el problema, porque se tiene que explicar. Sí. Necesitas que te enseñen lo que ha pasado. No, solo se piensa en una cosa. El señor O'Connell, para toda esta generación, no existe.
Visto en el museo de Barça, es un museo precioso, pero
no
hay una plaza para O'Connell y la gira como esto.
A mí que me pongan 400 fotografías automáticas, lo que vende, ese es el problema. Y yo te digo, tú vas a ver el museo que has visto, yo me quedo frío. Falta el material auténtico de estas cosas. Es jajaja, jijiji, es el olvido de tanta gente como el señor con el que estamos hablando y otros miles que han habido antes y que han dado muchas cosas por el club y no existen. No, lo tienen todo tapado. Y pierden una cosa, pierden el corazón.
On the 16th of May 1937, Barca and O'Connell left by night train in order not to be detected by the German and Italian bombers. And a few days later, they caught the boat in Bordeaux with 500 other refugees from Franco's war. Ángel Moore Sr. called the crossing to Mexico via a short stop in Cuba one long carnival.
Hombre, era gente joven, porque claro, se lo pasaron bomba. Estar 20 días o 25 o 30, claro. ¿Qué haces? Aunque entrenaran un poco por allí, por la cubierta, cuatro estiramientos, yo creo que entrenaban bailando.
So, fleeing the civil war in Spain, Patrick O'Connell and the FC Barcelona football team arrived to Mexico in June 1937. They moved in here to the majestic luxury hotel. It had recently been built, but honestly, in the 80 years since, it really hasn't changed that much.
Unfortunately, the hotel has not kept its ledger, so we don't know which room O'Connell stayed in. What the hotel has kept are these old newspaper clippings from the very week Barca arrives. And they show that O'Connell and his players had arrived to yet another political hornet's nest. In 1934, Lázaro Cárdenas had become president of Mexico. Cárdenas was originally an army general, but much to the surprise of the political establishment and the joy of the many poor in the country, he set out on what can only be described as a revolutionary path.
Sí, Lázaro Cárdenas era un presidente que podríamos llamar de izquierda, que inclusive rompió con el régimen que existía anterior. y él crea otra política más, te digo, más de izquierda, ¿no? Más enfocada a la gente, más en tratar de darle los derechos a los campesinos, a los obreros.
Playing on strong anti-imperialist feelings among the Mexicans, Cárdenas nationalized the oil industry and fell out with the US and European great powers.
Abogado sin estima, ya que estés desvergonzado. Vendieron nuestros terrenos a ingleses y americanos.
But in incredible scenes, the Mexicans handed over their gold, their silver, paintings, even kids' toys, so that the government could pay compensation to the foreign oil companies.
Cárdenas, con los obreros Cárdenas, con la justicia conquistó, para la patria manejar su economía.
Cárdenas, Mexico was a hotbed of progressive politics, with a host of intellectuals such as the painters Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera around the president. Cárdenas supported the Spanish Republic against Franco because he saw survival of democracy in Spain as a parallel to his own democratic project in Mexico.
En el plano de la ayuda a España, Cárdenas apoyó con todo a la República, con todo.
The boat Barca arrived on from France is a good illustration. It brought not only the Barca team, but also many refugee intellectuals and 450 children whose parents had been killed or imprisoned in the Civil War or were at the front.
Llegan muchos niños en el México, llegan en el mismo barco los jugadores del Barcelona.
Today, more than 80 years later, the few of these children who are still alive are the only eyewitnesses left to Barca's crossing to Mexico. And we managed to track one of them down in Mexico City. Barca was in the first class, the children in third, but in between working out sessions, O'Connell allowed the players to mingle, as Xuan Yop, who was only 5 when he was sent on the boat to Mexico, remembers.
Íbamos al donde estaban desayunando los del Barça y pues nos daban pan con mantequilla, nos sentaban en las rodillas, eran cariñosos con nosotros. No es que tuvieran mucho contacto con ellos, pero sí eran cariñosos. Yo no me acuerdo qué nos daban a nosotros de comer, pero sí me acuerdo que en alguna ocasión ellos, que mesa con mantequilla y tal, no sé si a nosotros nos daban lo mismo, pero ellos como venían en otras circunstancias, soy apasionado del Barça. Sí, es lo único que me apasiona, desde luego, y me pone malo. Yo luego entiendo y me lo dice mi mujer y me lo dice todo el mundo, y yo lo entiendo, que 11 fulanos pegándole a una pelota, le meten un gol y lo siento, y estoy sufriendo y casi no duermo. Digo, bueno, pues es que soy tonto, digo.
So on the 7th of June 1937, the boat with 450 refugee children and the Barca team and their Irish trainer arrived to Veracruz on the Caribbean coast of Mexico, all on the run from Franco. Tens of thousands of people were there to greet them.
Y desde luego fue un recibimiento en Veracruz bárbaro. Estaba, pero que no se podía pasar. Era una cuestión verdaderamente de locura.
Summer afternoons in Mexico always bring heavy rainfall, and none of the stadiums had floodlights back then, so the matches were played in the mornings. Barca won most of their matches, and the Mexicans were deeply impressed by O'Connell's team.
The football that Barca plays is more practical. This is typical O'Connell, not the brilliance, but practical, efficient, and results. And this is the way he made Barca play as well. They describe O'Connell as an old wolf of football, and say that Mexican trainers can learn a lot from him.
the old wolf.
And this is a very interesting one. It says here that the players of Barcelona were presented on the pitch one after another, and they received a warm welcome, and that here we see the trainer, Mr. O'Connell, thank the audience for this warm welcome.
Los estadios estaban llenos, sabían quiénes eran estos jugadores y sí, la gente los recibe con mucho cariño, ¿no? Cuando los mismos jugadores comienzan a hablar, empiezan a decir lo que piensan de lo que está sucediendo en España, dar su opinión, y como que todo mundo, dentro del mundo del fútbol y fuera de él, se empiezan a hacer a la causa del Barcelona, viendo que están en gira porque el equipo podía desaparecer.
The official Barca version says that the trip was financed by a former Barca baseball player by the name of Soriano Mas. He was now a successful businessman in Mexico. But Carlos Calderón, who has researched this in detail, tells quite another story, one which shows a much closer involvement of the Mexican president himself.
Baltasar Junco, y es uno de los que habla con el presidente Cárdenas. Junco, Baltasar Junco. Baltasar Junco se pone de acuerdo con un beisbolista español.
Con Soriano Mes.
Él es un intermediario, en realidad, habla con Cárdenas directamente. Junco le da el encargo de un contacto. Pero el que hace ya todos los trámites, el que los trae, el que habla con Cárdenas, todo eso lo hace Baltasar Junco, pensando en ayudar a la causa. Sino que ya que están en la Ciudad de México, los jugadores del Barcelona hacen una reunión, se van al Ángel de la Independencia, inclusive hay fotografías de eso, y hacen una reunión con el presidente, porque el presidente está consciente de que los jugadores del Barcelona han sufrido mucho. Ya la muerte de su presidente, por ejemplo, ¿no? A manos del franquismo, de lo que sería el franquismo después, pero es también como un apoyo a estos futbolistas.
Literally, as Barca was playing, making friends and getting political attention in Mexico, Franco at home in Spain was trying desperately to make FIFA ban the Barca team. It was by now clear that Franco was not going to take Barca's propaganda trip lying down.
Había una guerra diplomática entre la República y los franquistas por el reconocimiento internacional, porque se entendía también que el deporte podía tener pues, este aspecto propagandístico. Rosén Calvet les dio las tres opciones, es decir, podían volver y si querían, cuando estuvieran en Francia, podían entrar por San Sebastián a la España franquista, podían volver a la España republicana o se podían quedar fuera, ¿no? Entonces, la mayor parte se quedaron, muchos en México, y creo que eran 4 o 5, más el entrenador, más Connor, y Rosén Calvet volvieron a Barcelona.
One of the clubs Barca played against in 1937 was Club América, the biggest and most popular club in Mexico. Their old stadium no longer exists. Today, Club América plays at the enormous Aztec Stadium, where football's 2 most famous goals ever were scored, both by Diego Maradona. The Hand of God goal, of course, and then that goal. The fresh-cut grass makes you almost smell it.
Ahí lo tiene Maradona, lo marcan 2, pisa la pelota Maradona, arranca por la derecha el genio del fútbol mundial, y deja el tercero a tocar para Borruchaga, siempre Maradona, genio, ¡gol!
And 31 years later, this still makes Irish and Scotsmen smile.
Estoy contigo, oye mi corazón. América, América.
Pasa muy frecuentemente, muy frecuentemente. Un compañero mío, quiero evitar el nombre, se quedó sin un peso. Pasa muy frecuentemente. Nosotros les exigimos que estudien, a fuerzas tienen que estudiar, tienen que prepararse, tenemos psicólogo, tenemos nutriólogo, tenemos coaching. ¿Para qué? Para que los que no lleguen se vayan agradecidos, se vayan buenos ciudadanos. Te lo voy a traer, mira, ¿dónde está? Carlos, ¿está Diego Lainez? Diego, ven. He is 16 years old.
And he's from inside the system.
¿Desde cuándo estás aquí? ¿Cuántos años?
Desde los 13.
13. A fuerzas tienes que estudiar aquí, te exigen estudios.
Sí, es un balance de estudio y de escuela. Sí. Estudias en la mañana o en la tarde y entrenas en mañana o tarde.
Tienes una base, no solamente con jugador, pero también en la escuela con educación, ¿no?
Sí, también tienes que tener tu educación, es importante, y te lo pide el club.
Porque el fútbol te va a durar un día, un mes, un año, o 10 o 15. ¿Y a los 30 años qué va a hacer? ¿O 35 años? Ok, dale.
Suerte, ¿eh?
The last match Barca played in Mexico was deep in the mountains in the little town of Orizaba. Here we were told they would have the only stadium which Barca played in 1937, which is still standing. Although it is a little bit difficult to imagine Barca on this pitch.
So believe it or not, this is... So believe it or not, this is where... So believe it or not, this is where FC Barcelona and Patrick O'Connell played their last match in Mexico. It was in late August 1937. There was about 4,000 to 5,000 spectators who had paid good money to see the famous Barcelona team. Barca won 7-2 against the local team. But as you can see, there really is nothing left of the place. Yeah.
But then we had a great surprise.
Yo, quick! This guy was at the match.
Eduardo was 11 when Barca played here. Today he's 92, but he's still up working at 4 o'clock every morning in his bakery.
En agosto 37 jugaba el Barça aquí, ¿sí?
Aquí, sí.
Y
aquí.
Así hiciste, ¿no?
En este campo.
Sí, y tú así hiciste.
Yo me encargué una media de uno que no nos dejaban entrar. Estábamos chamacos, ¿no? Sí. Y ahí atrás un baúl grandote que traían con balones, sí. y ya sabíamos que venían huyendo de la guerra de España.
Mm-hmm. Back in the 1940s, Eduardo was in fact himself a semi-professional player. And he still remembers all details from the day Barca played here 80 years ago.
Hizo el campo, el mejor campo que había.
¿Sí?
Corriente, primoroso, era una mesa de billar. Sí me acuerdo de Martín Bantorra, una maravilla. Bueno, estábamos de un equipo Atlante que fue campeón, con él a la delantera. Estaba anotado como el mejor extremo derecho del mundo. Sí. Martín Bantorra, yo lo marqué a Martín Bantorra. Sí.
Ventura was not just one of the best players in the world, he was also a famous Catalan nationalist and chairman of the Players' Union. It was therefore no surprise that he chose to stay in Mexico, as he would have been in real danger back in Spain.
¿Eres de Barcelona?
Ah, claro, ¿sí? Sobre el Real Madrid, sobre el Real Madrid.
Muy bien, muy bien.
Me gusta, Messi es una maravilla, el Neymar es otra maravilla, sí. Y el central es una maravilla.
Orizaba is a football-mad place, and recently the city council even opened a museum dedicated to football. The museum is located in the former town hall, and Patrick O'Connell and the Barca players would therefore have been received here in 1937. We wanted to see if the rumor was right that the museum had the original poster from the match Barca played here 80 years ago. And there it was. Recently, local football fans had found it hanging in a bar, still in pristine condition.
Sabemos perfectamente que vino este equipo, que por los conflictos de la guerra en España, Orizaba y Río Blanco se honró en recibirlo en aquella ocasión. Es algo muy importante para esta región. Sombra general significa bajo techo, 3 pesos. 3 pesos costaba, sí. Y ya los que estaban en el sol, ya más barato, 1.50, sí.
The poster promises the spectators that the local team will be organized well and include players called the Pirate and the Cuttlefish. Gustavo took us through town to meet Orizabala's football mad mayor. Because of the drugs war, Mexico is now the second most dangerous country in the world after Syria. And this seemingly so tranquil part of the country is in fact one of the most violent. But we did not encounter any trouble.
El equipo de fútbol Barcelona en Orizaba. Hoy a las 3:30 de la tarde llegará a México el formidable equipo catalán.
The coverage here was, it must be said, rather biased in favor of the local team.
Ayer, los catalanes, a pesar de ser completamente superiores al Sidosa, se vieron en apuros para salir avantes. Ya ves, les costó trabajo. Ganaron 7-2, pero les costó trabajo. A los 2 minutos de iniciado el segundo tiempo, el formidable Titi empata la anotación producto de un gran pase del Pirata Fuente, que lucharon con, fíjate, no dice casi nada de los jugadores del Barcelona. Se me hace que jugó contra el Juventus.
From Mexico, Barca went by boat to New York, where they played and won 4 more matches. The US government was, like England and France, sitting on the fence in the Spanish conflict, and Barca's trip to New York was a very clear attempt to sway public opinion.
En España, es decir, que había una corriente de simpatía mayoritaria por la República y esos 4 partidos ahí pues encajaron bien, ¿no? Y por lo tanto le quiere dar una parte política, ¿no? muy clara.
Casi oficialmente representante.
Claro. Sí.
Más que un club, ¿no?
Claro,
sí.
Más que un club, sí.
Barca and O'Connell left New York with $15,000, the money which would save FC Barcelona Football Club.
El dinero se quedó en París, depositado en un banco francés porque pensaban que aquí les sería requisado. Y por eso fue ese dinero que salvó económicamente al Barça en la posguerra.
Of the many surprising facts in O'Connell's life, his return to Barcelona in October 1937 is probably the most surprising. The city was ravaged by war, and O'Connell hardly had a team left to manage, seeing as only 5 of his players had returned with him from Mexico. By late 1937, Franco's troops were getting very close to Barcelona. In one particularly horrific night in March 1938, 2,000 people were killed by Italian bombs, which also hit the Barcelona club office. And what was O'Connell's reaction? Well, there is a legend in Barca that the Irishman, upon seeing the destruction of the club office, with a hint to the famine in his own country 100 years earlier, simply said, "As long as there's potatoes to be had, I will stay." And in this case, he certainly was as good as his word.
El salario de O'Connor también se reduce, que en aquel momento era de 1.500 pesetas mensuales, y se lo reducen a 1.000.
¿En serio?
Sí, y él lo acepta, ¿no? Este es el libro de actas del club. Esto es el acto de enero de 1938. El señor Patrick O'Connell percibirá a partir del mes de julio del 37, el acuerdo era de enero del 38, es decir, que era para atrás.
Santa Cana shows me a letter which illustrates the football madness in this place, even during times of war.
Un seguidor del Barça le escribe al club para preguntar por los resultados de la gira, y Rosen Calvet, y se lo envía. La gracia es que se lo envía a este señor a la 145 Brigada Mixta, 44 División Segunda Compañía, Segundo Batallón.
Es increíble, es increíble.
Y tienes, ¿no?, lo que te comentaba, ¿no?, ¿no?
Es increíble. Sí.
Su encanto, ¿no?, con el resultado de la gira.
De la guerra civil.
Sí.
Sí, es increíble. Es algo realmente increíble.
Sí.
The Spanish league had been suspended and a Catalan league was barely scraped together. But the local media praised O'Connell's rebuilding of the young Barca team, even though he constantly lost players when they were called to the war front. In January 1939, Franco's troops occupy Barcelona and execute 10,000 people as revenge. Hundreds of thousands flee through the snow over the Pyrenees to France.
The new ruler of Spain rides into the city of his conquest. Behind him is Moors, his army lines the route.
In the spring of 1939, O'Connell and his wife leave to go and stay with her family in Cork. During all those years, how is it possible that nobody at home, including his own family, his first wife and 4 kids, knew nothing about O'Connell's exploits?
It could have been the end. And, it could have been the end for Barcelona. But without his role, without the part that he plays, it's possible that Barcelona don't survive. It's possible that none of this is the same. It's possible. And I think that's one of the reasons why people have embraced the idea that it's important to commemorate him. It's important to recognise his significance, to recognise that an Irishman, without him, this Barcelona possibly doesn't exist. Without him, this Betis has never won a league title, that's for certain. And there are plenty of clubs, and Spanish football as a whole, I think, that owes him an enormous debt of gratitude.
As a historian, have you seen is there actually any evidence that anybody in the 1920s or 30s here knew what one of their countrymen was running around doing in Spain?
No, I haven't encountered it. We think about Barcelona as a club that embodied that kind of Republican spirit, but that sympathy with the Spanish Republic was really not to be found in the Ireland of the 1930s. We had an enormous Red Scare here. I think Franco connected with many people in Ireland because he was an anti-communist figure. They believed he was a defender of the faith. So Patrick O'Connell, as someone that had aligned himself so clearly with a football club of the Republic, would not have been an enormously popular figure. What he did with Barcelona would not have set well.
By 1939, O'Connell's family in Manchester, the one he'd left behind, had not heard from him or indeed received any money from him for 16 years. He'd last sent them some pesetas back in 1923.
Because the family were always broke. They were always searching for the next penny, wherever it came from. It's always one step ahead of the money lender and hiding from the rent man. So that's how the family got by.
By then, Mike O'Connell, Patrick's grandson, had been abandoned by his own father and was growing up in the house of his grandmother, the wife O'Connell had left behind in Manchester.
How much did the family know? Did they know where he was?
They knew there's a connection at the beginning with Santander. And
because that's where the money came
nothing.
from.
Knew nothing. Until, for some reason, they discovered, I think it was from Larry, that there's a connection with Barcelona.
His brother Larry was the only person with whom O'Connell seemed to have stayed in some sort of contact.
The others all thought he was wonderful. This shit, sorry about that, this chap who treated them all so badly, deserted them, left them in poverty. And then Gran would come out about how wonderful he was, what a wonderful man he was. And she believed that to a dying day.
So O'Connell and his second wife spent the summer of 1939 with her family in Cork in Ireland.
But he couldn't really stay in Ireland because Ireland isn't that big a place. Somebody would have known him, and he had no right to be remarried. I mean, it was a bigamous marriage. Yeah, he could have been put in prison if it had been found out.
In March 1940, O'Connell returns to Seville, the place of his biggest triumph, the 1935 championship with Betis. But a lot has changed in the club Betis, in the city of Seville, and the whole country.
Son los años más duros del franquismo y durante todo el periodo de la guerra civil como tal, Sevilla está dentro de la retaguardia de la zona franquista. Digamos que la ciudad, cuando O'Connell llega en el año 40, está, yo diría la palabra, domesticada. Y no hay una oposición. O estaban en el exilio, o estaban en las cárceles, o los habían fusilado.
So by May 1940, O'Connell was again...
¡Viva el Betis! ¡Viva el Betis!
¡Viva el Betis! So by May 1940, O'Connell was again in charge of his Betis. Although, of course, the stadium was nowhere near as impressive as it is now. Y ahora, hoy ganará a la vez, ¿no?
Hoy gana Betis, hoy gana Betis.
Betis, no Sevilla, Sevilla.
Betis.
Betis, ¿por qué?
Betis is the best thing of the world.
Oh, muy bien, gracias. By now, Franco had renamed the Spanish Cup tournament in his own honor, La Copa de Su Excelencia el Generalísimo. And the players were forced to salute him in fascist style. And if O'Connell still had any doubts that times had changed, just a few hundred meters away from the stadium, literally just down that road, there now was a concentration camp. This is the memorial for the concentration camp, only a few hundred meters from the Betis Stadium. Prison workers, actually slave workers here, would be building roads and bridges and canals. All over Spain from 1937 to the late 1940s, 500,000 people went through such camps. Just alone in Seville, there were 10 of them. So all this horror had taken place and was still going on within a few kilometers from where O'Connell lived and worked when he returns in 1940. And he must have known about it. Nevertheless, he returns, because he loved life and people in Sevilla, but also for a very different reason. He had to get away from Ireland. Here in Spain, nobody knew that O'Connell was bigamously married, not even the woman he was married to. But how on earth did he manage to keep working and living in Franco Spain?
The Franco regime, incredibly repressive, physically repressive, culturally repressive, socially repressive, and that applies entirely to football because the regime is aware of football's power.
And lots of footballers are banned.
Yes.
Of course, the Barcelona players.
All of the Barcelona players who go on tour are given bans of varying degrees between 6 months and 2 years. You have players, obviously, whose commitment to the Republican cause has been greater than that, who basically don't play again. You have, of course, people exiled, and of course, as footballers, as people who are known, even to a much lesser extent than happens these days, there is no way of hiding from that.
Of course, there's one notable exception to the banning, not Mr. O'Connell.
And that, I think, is one of the enduring mysteries. Quite why it is in an environment like that, an environment of spying, of repression, of the denial of opportunity to those who are seen as politically suspect, even in the most minor way. Quite why it was that O'Connell seems to have been, not entirely, but largely unaffected by that. So the fact that O'Connell came back, and we believe, now we don't know what kind of pacts were made, we don't know what kind of conversations were had, but there is a sense that, how did you do this? How did you get back and this not be a problem? How did you get on with your life as a public figure and this not to be problematic? Now,
in 1935, O'Connell had left Betis as champions. But 5 years of poor financial management and civil war had left them broke and in the second division. But within a year, Patrick O'Connell had them back in the top flight.
Fue utilizado por las tropas italianas que marchaban al frente de Málaga para conquistar Málaga en febrero del 37 y fue utilizado como una base logística militar donde tenían sus vehículos y demás historias. Y el Betis durante los años de la guerra tiene una actividad bastante escasa. El caso del equipo rival es totalmente al contrario y el Sevilla está viviendo su época más dorada y es uno de los equipos que lucha por los títulos.
As we know by now, Patrick O'Connell was a man of many firsts. He was the captain of Ireland when they won the first British Home Championship. He was the first Irishman to captain Man United. He was a British transfer record when he went there. And of course, he was the manager of Real Betis when they won their only championship in 1935. And then, in 1942, O'Connell performs what's probably his biggest first. He crosses town from Real Betis and goes here to the arch-enemy Sevilla FC.
Also here, O'Connell is highly successful. As usual, he finds young talents, and the team places second and third in La Liga. But the very fact O'Connell went from Betis to the arch-rival was considered a total scandal. And this is not even a match, it's just a Betis warm-up. And I can assure you that the same thing is happening on the other side of town. On top of that, O'Connell continued to live in the Betis neighborhood, hanging out with his old mates. At O'Connell's old favorite bar, I meet up with some of the writers of a book about the Betis-Sevilla derby.
Y en el club Sevilla Fútbol Club le dicen, hombre, no está bien que tú vayas a la tertulia bética, ¿sí? Y él dice, pues son mis amigos, es mi antiguo club y yo voy a seguir yendo allí a tomar mi café y mis cervezas, ¿no? Venía aquí y muchas veces aquí hacía las alineaciones. El equipo que iba a jugar el próximo domingo se sentaba en la barra y junto con el camarero de entonces, pues charlaban sobre la alineación y formaba el equipo, ¿no? Pero él consigue que el Sevilla se sitúe ya como un equipo sólido que poco después ganaría la Liga, ¿no? Por primera vez. Entonces hace también una gran labor en el Sevilla Fútbol Club.
Entonces, para nosotros, insisto, el Betis algo más allá de política, algo más allá de fútbol, algo más allá, una forma de vida y una rivalidad que viene por una diferencia de clase, una diferencia a la hora de entender la vida. Para todo el mundo en el Betis, Patrick O'Connell es un mito del fútbol.
Los béticos
conocemos, claro, sí. Tenemos una liga como para no conocerlo.
In O'Connell's old bar, I talk to a couple and they can't even agree on which is the oldest club.
The oldest is Sevilla.
Oh,
Sevilla.
I mean, you know, there's a lot of controversy about this issue, and Betis is the first team of the city.
My whole family is Sevillista.
Our two sons are Beticos. Okay, now
yes.
This is the thing: when you would be rooting against me and against your sons, and for your team.
I remember the first moment, the first day that I went to the Peña Bética. Never in my life. What I do here with every wall green, the people Betico person, my father would say about me. Is here in Seville, when you're born, you are Betis or Sevilla.
It's the game, right? But no, people here, it's not a game. It's their identity, man.
Incredibly, after 3 years at Sevilla Football Club, O'Connell once again returns to Real Betis and later again even to Santander, 25 years after he first arrived there. In both clubs he once again works his magic, with promotion as result, but both are now poor third division clubs and the jobs only last for a year.
The very late 40s where he's sort of sliding a little bit out of football, he goes back to Santander and it doesn't quite work out.
By 1950, he was over 60.
Yeah.
And he was earning very tiny amounts acting as a scout for 2 or 3 clubs, very small amounts as a scout, and clearly that wasn't enough.
In 1950, one of O'Connell's sons tracks him down to Seville.
And Dan and his partner Michael came to Seville, and it was arranged that Dan would meet his dad in, we think it was this park.
It was this park.
Because it's quite close by to that where he was living. So he met with his dad, and it was no happy reunion, oh, Daddy, or oh, Dan, wonderful. None of that. The first thing that Patrick asked his son when they met was how Manchester United was getting on.
After not having seen him for 30 years?
After not having seen him for all that time.
Didn't ask a question about his wife, about the family. They did not get on.
No.
Dan, when he came back, told me face to face the story, and he hated his father. He had to pretend that he was a nephew if anybody came along.
He was a nephew from Dublin.
He was a nephew from Dublin.
Because O'Connell here didn't want anybody to know, obviously, about...
Absolutely.
These were years of widespread poverty and even hunger in Spain. We know that Ellen was teaching English to local kids to make ends meet. In 1954, Betis and Sevilla arranged a testimonial for O'Connell.
Para que él y su pareja, su esposa, viviesen, porque llegó a tener problemas económicos graves. Los periódicos de aquel momento, del partido Homenaje, años 50 y tantos, hablan muy positivamente de él. Un caballero, una persona cortés, elegante, educada, un gran hombre en la historia del Betis y del Sevilla. Y fue el último acto público de don Patricio. O'Connell tiene un par de frases maravillosas, ¿no? Que de los sevillanos, que eran unas personas que vivían como si esa noche se acabara el mundo, ¿no? Festejaban, gozaban, vivían intensamente cada día. Cuando se tuvo que ir lo lamentó mucho. En una entrevista, en su última entrevista, decía que creía que iba a vivir hasta la muerte en Sevilla, pero que por desgracia debía volver a su país a unos asuntos.
I'll just say one last word about Patrick O'Connell and this grave. I think Patrick O'Connell was a strange creature because he was very successful at influencing others, but I think he was a real loner despite the outward style of his life. All he wanted was to smoke continuously and drink red wine continuously. I think that's how he was. And this house were owned by Patrick O'Connell's brother Larry.
The O'Connells arrived to dour post-war London in the autumn of 1954. We don't know how Ellen found out that her husband had a whole other family, or rather that he had left a whole other family 30 years earlier.
She didn't know until very late in the marriage, possibly when they came back to England, because he'd been pulling the wool over her eyes for 30 years.
She was a fanatical Catholic, church every night Catholic.
And she didn't know she committed this awful sin, and she had done, and so she left him.
Patrick O'Connell stayed with his brother Larry, who ran a boarding house in Camden. But even his family just up the road in Manchester did not know he had returned.
I was at university, and it was about 2 or 3 years after I left university that he died. I did not know he was back in England.
So you had nobody heard in the family knew that he was back apart from Larry, obviously. But...
Yes.
And Larry was like a brick wall between the family in Manchester and his brother. Well, he was an exceptional footballer, but as a husband and a father, you can see down the generations, he was terrible. He was a non-starter. He was awful.
You were a sports writer in Dublin in the 1950s.
Yes.
And at that point, as we know, O'Connell was living in poverty just over in London, and eventually in '59 died in a pauper. At that point, there was no talk about this?
Oh, absolutely none. It seems to me that O'Connell distanced himself from football in his latter years. His determination almost to stay undercover, you know, and that again begs the question, did he in his latter years regret what he had done in walking away from his 4 children?
O'Connell lived 5 years in Camden. But I went through every local newspaper for that period. Not one single word was published about a former Man United captain and Barca manager living in the neighbourhood.
Unfortunately, you know, we look at our world in football, particularly Premier League stars over the last number of years, the statistics are horrible. 3 in 5 get divorced after their career ends, and 2 in 5 go bankrupt. That's a fact. That's an incredible fact. But that tells you that the problems are still alive. The problems that Patrick O'Connell had are still very much alive today.
Right.
I am not in the least bit surprised that Patrick O'Connell ended up where he did, because when the lights went out for him in his football, and when he had gone and done what he'd done as a player and done what he'd done as a coach in Spain and got the adulation that he did for so long, and then it came to an end, footballers from his time to this time, they hit low spots. And the way I try and describe it to people is, you know, all their lives they've been wired up, geared up to be the best, and that meant the best in front of the watching public, the hundreds of thousands of millions that would have watched Spanish football in his time. And when that's taken away from you, all the wires that you have inside you that drive you to do that are suddenly cut, and you're told, off you go, you're on your own now. And there's nobody there for you because your support structure has broken down. And you probably try and get yourself out of it, but you're starting a slippery slope. The depression kicks in. You know, you're feeling worthless. This isn't just Patrick O'Connell. This is every footballer who I know. This is me, and I'll tell you a bit more about it in a moment.
And it's a good cross for Quinn! Delivered by David White, met by Niall Quinn.
And I got very depressed for a good 6 to 12 months. Nothing would take me out of it. She didn't recognise me, my wife, which incidentally led her to go back to college to take a psychology degree, and her master's now, her thesis is on footballers like me who turn into complete, you know, raging idiots when their career finishes because no preparation was in place. So the correct phrase, I think, is the transitioning athlete.
In 1957, FC Barcelona celebrates its new stadium Nou Camp. At the same time, the man who saved the club only 20 years earlier is collecting a few quid a week in national assistance.
I was the chairman of a football club. It wasn't part of my 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, it was actually a 7-day week job, to worry about how somebody who played 15 years ago with that club is getting on. Selfishly.
Niall and Gillian Quinn are now working to convince the Premier League, the clubs and even the agents that this work is needed.
I really want to shake people. You know, I really want to say to them, you've got to wake up and see this coming. But maybe an ex-player who everybody trusts and loves at the club, who's educated and brought in to dealing with this, can put the support services in place and the education service in place for players and their wives. Most important that there's a team effort going on here so they both see the future together. You know, we feel the next step for us will be to convince the agency networks that part of their service to their clients should be preparing them for what we all know is an inevitable fall. But without it, people face dropping in a hole, and sadly that's where it ended up for Patrick O'Connell.
On the 27th of February 1959, Patrick Joseph O'Connell dies from pneumonia. He's buried in an unmarked grave with only his brother attending the funeral. And nobody in his two families is told about his death. I went to check with a couple of old boys who already were professionals in the late 1950s. Did they hear about O'Connell and his struggles in London at the time?
There was never any mention or in the newspapers or even among professionals?
No, and I mean, you know, at Swindon, Norman Pritchard was there. He was an Irish goalkeeper. You know, and one or two people I played with at Swindon were Irish players, you know. But no name, nothing at all. You know, I find it impossible to come to terms with a situation where a man can go off the radar and be in an unmarked grave for 57 years. Tell me about that. You tell me, I don't know. It's ridiculous. Probably as successful as anybody, even you could compare him with Sir Alex Ferguson or Guardiola or Bill Nicholson or Shankly. How can he suddenly go off the radar? But if there had been someone there in those days that could have helped Patrick O'Connell, but there was somebody there, all the clubs he played for and made successful, you know, surely somewhere along the line, someone must have said, what's happened to Patrick O'Connell? You've got a man there that's been more successful 4 times, 5 times more than I've ever been successful, and he ends up in a pauper's grave. Someone's got to be responsible for that. Who could it be? Tell me.
The years O'Connell spent in hardship down in London and the day he died, legendary goalkeeper Harry Gregg was going to training in the club O'Connell used to captain, Manchester United.
From 56, 57, 58, 59 until he died, did anybody in Manchester United talk about him? You never heard him?
No.
Thinking back, don't you think that's amazing when you think about a guy who broke for Man United, who broke the British transfer record,
yes,
who trained Barcelona, who did all these, and nobody ever talked about that he lived?
Never heard of. I mean, you've asked me a question, and me, because of my nature, and him being Irish, I would have known. It would have come to me, no. There was no talk about it at all.
And when you look back at it now, doesn't that...
I think it's tragic, I think it's sad.
And slightly incredible as well. I mean,
it's incredible, it is indeed.
It is, of course, impossible to avoid parallels to Harry's close friend and teammate, George Best.
He cried like a baby and said, H promised me you'll ring me tomorrow. And it did. And I rang on the Thursday and he signed himself out. The next time was when Saturday I carried his coffin. So you can talk about Patrick O'Connell, George Best. Yeah, it can happen to people, it happened to other people as well. Yeah. Tragic story. From greatness to the graveyard. That's how it was. No one, or very few people would know, to be brutally honest, that the man ever existed. I think that's tragic. I think that's tragic. Sad and tragic.
There's also the generation thing that in the modern world, each individual is the centre of the universe. And I think his generation was a generation where you didn't talk about yourself. You just were very reserved about your own affairs and what you'd done and so on. And also restricted with money. The combination of the generation restriction of money, he'd be like a ghost walking around there.